If sheep and swine and lions strong and all the bovine crew could paint with cunning hands and do what clever mortals do, depend upon it, every pig with snout so broad and blunt would make a Jove that like himself would thunder with a grunt, and every lion's god would roar, and every bull's would bellow, and every sheep's would baa, and every beast his worshipped fellow would find in some immortal form, and not exist divine, but had the gait of lions, sheep, or ox, or grunting swine. That is a xenophanes fragment from a long time ago, no doubt converted into pretentious English, speaking from what is now Turkey. Additionally, Ethiopians say that their gods are snub-nosed and black, Thracians that they are pale and red-haired. Sages came across an article criticizing white Europeans for their representations of Jesus as white. But everybody does this. That old book claims God created us in its image, but even the Greek philosophers knew that in truth we constantly create our gods in our own image. The truth is that there have been as many Jesuses as there have been cultures that worship him, and they've all reflected in some way the indigenous cultures that the localized syncretic concepts of Christianity have been constructed around. You get Jesus as warrior king. Sometimes we forget that the Muslims did not create the jihad. Jihad was a response to Heraclius. Onward, Christian soldier. And jihad is a Christian idea. So we have Jesus as warrior king, Jesus as sage, or Jesus as Odin, perhaps. Jesus as fire-breathing zealot. It's a kind of blank slate to scroll over. If you actually trace the different representations of Jesus through time, you do get a variety of different concepts. Jesus seems to get a little whiter from the medieval period into the Renaissance as he becomes less Italian-looking and more German-looking. The Byzantine Jesus looks pretty Greek, really. And before that, well, it looks kind of Jewish. That is kind of tan, but ultimately pretty Caucasian. And you see that in the earliest representations of Jesus. It looks kind of Ashkenazi, even though it's before what we consider the ethnogenesis of the Ashkenazi Jewish nation. I'm just pushing back against the idea that Jesus would have looked like an Arab, because it's pretty historical, and it is, okay? The Arab migration into the region didn't happen for a few more hundred years. Rather, at the time of Jesus, migration into the Levant would have been mostly from the north and the east, Iranians, Greeks, and Italians. And before that, you had Assyrians and other people from the north, right? The legend is that Abraham was a Sumerian. Sumerians weren't actually even Semites. That's the strange thing about it. In fact, we know from ancient records that Sumerians were essentially Caucasians, and we know, and that's something to point out because it's unusual in the region, right? We're talking about the Fertile Crescent here, smack dab in the middle of what is now the Arab world. We don't expect to see Caucasians there in deep antiquity, but every representation of the Sumerians that we've ever seen makes them look kind of like Russians. As far as all of the evidence we have suggests that the Sumerians were pretty white, and if the Jews trace their ancestry from them, we really have every reason to think that. Most of the evidence that we have pictorially is from Egypt or Assyria, and they all suggest that the Jews were fairly Caucasian-looking as well. So it's pretty consistent, actually, all the way through. I have some other theories about this, but I'm gonna take a step back from them. The reality is that most of the migration in the centuries immediately leading up to Jesus. Most of the migration into the region was white and Caucasian, and essentially all of the meaningful representation that we have of Jews in early periods suggests that they were Caucasian. This Arab movement of people didn't happen until the 7th century. Or, maybe a little earlier than that if you want to start talking about border tribes, but certainly well after the death of Jesus, right? Now, I know, modern historians, they want this continuity, right? People in the region currently look like Arab, therefore they always did. They reject their own destruction horizons. It really doesn't work with the full scale of evidence. It's just an ideological attempt to reject racism. Okay? It's not. It's what we call history today has been very, very badly compromised. It's lost a lot of its focus on evidence and has adopted this kind of this kind of goes back to the same thing I was talking about with economics, right? It wants theory, and it rejects evidence in favor of theory, and it's backwards thinking. Okay, we currently live in a reality where backwards thinking is paramount. It's most of academia wants to focus more on theory and reject evidence, and they see empiricism as just a way to uphold their theories, but they want their theories to be ultimately what they retreat to, and they'll reject evidence if it does not uphold their theory, right? This is one instance of this, right? This insistence on continuity, despite the fact that the evidence just does not uphold it, okay? Now, my perspective on this is that I don't think we need to make shit up to reject racism. I think the evidence in front of us is pretty strong. Okay? And often, when you analyze their arguments, they actually come off as racist. When you really understand it, right? So, I don't think that... I mean, if you want to create this world where white people are always at the top of a hierarchy, and there's never any conflict, that's not anti-racist. To me, that's intrinsically deeply racist. To me, a world that is opposed, or the racism is ultimately an empirical question, right? So, to me, the evidence that rejects racism, I mean, even that itself, right? Like, if you just take an assumption that racism is wrong, then, I mean, you're just giving racists more fuel, because they're going to look at evidence and they're going to try and skew it, right? But to me, what the evidence actually suggests is that we live in a world where there is no racial or no permanent racial hierarchy, right? There are racial hierarchies, but they're impermanent, they dissolve, they flip around, right? So when I suggest that, for example, the Ottoman system was a structural system of racism with whites at the bottom of it, and I say, okay, that existed, and then you have the system in the United States or South Africa, which was a structural system of racism with whites at the top of it. To me, if you want to present the argument that races are equal, you need to have that. Okay? You need to have evidence that suggests that there are systems with whites at the top and systems with whites at the bottom. If every system that's ever existed in the history of the world has whites at the top of a hierarchy, then the conclusion that you have to draw is that whites are superior. But in fact, that's not what the evidence says. What the evidence suggests is that there are systems, and there have been systems, okay, where whites have been the lowest people in the hierarchy have been brutally enslaved. Okay, um, so I really don't think they're doing this right. If what they're trying to do is reject racism, what they should be doing is they should be pointing out that um, there have been systems of slavery, systems of race-based slavery throughout the world with every different group at the top and every different group at the bottom, right? And in fact, that what it's about is about power. It's about majorities and minorities. It's really not about actual racial characteristics, right? But if you want to cement a world, okay, where everything has always been the way it is now, I mean, I mean, you're basically rejecting the concept of history, right? So I don't like. I mean, I'm going to reject the continuity in history on two levels. One, because I don't think the evidence actually supports it, and two, because I think that the ideological approach that upholds it and leads it to reject evidence doesn't really imply what they claim it implies. In fact, it implies the opposite, right? The three different types of Jews that exist today are all various mixed ancestry. Okay, you've got the Ashkenazi that are kind of Turkish and Slavic, right? This gets very contentious very quickly, but I think that the evidence actually is that at some point, most of them did come from somewhere around the Ukraine, right? And the Sephardi and Mizrahi have both absorbed a lot of Arab. That's the truth of it, right? If you work out the genetics, the closest thing we have to an ancestral population of Jews is actually the Kurds, who are actually an Iranian people, right? I have my own ideas about where the Kurds came from. I think they were essentially. See, the Kurds don't really exist in history until the Islamic conquest of the region. So I think, and I mean the word it literally translates to something like nomadic refugee. There were refugees, right? But what that means is that they were the Iranians that lived around the areas of Iraq today and that fled the Arabian incursion. Now, the Arabs didn't do body counts, right? So they didn't really take note of it. They were just, the people that were pushed out, right? And so it's just all very consistent when you recognize that, right? That the Kurds are probably I mean, they weren't Kurds before then, right? Before about the year 800 or so, they weren't Kurds, they were just Iranians, right? But nonetheless, that is probably the ancestral gene pool that the ancient Jews came from, right? And then, once after the Muslim invasion, there was a lot of mix between Arabs and Jews. You have the I mean, who are the Palestinians? The Palestinians are the Jews, right? They're the descendants of the Jews that stayed in the region, but there was a lot of intermixing, right? So Arabs moved into the region, they married the Jews, they converted them to Islam, and that's, these are the descendants of the Hebrews, right? Some of them left, they went one way or the other, but the ones that are probably the closest to the actual Jews that existed at the time are not the darker skinned ones that are the consequence of the movement of Arabs in afterwards. Okay, but the lighter skinned ones that they came directly from the infusion of Iranian tribes, Iranian and Sumerian peoples, sometime very, very far in the past, right? And that's just what the genetics say. The genetics say that Jews are actually not as closely related to Palestinians and Arabs as they are related to Kurds, right? Like I said, this is a really complicated and contested thing to try and sort through. I have a hard time trying to work all that out without getting someone. you're going to say something that's going to piss someone off at some point, right? So it's really, really hard thing to try and sort through and understand, but it's something also that just about everybody agrees is actually true, right? Who were the ancient Jews? They were like the Kurds, of Sumerian, Iranian background that adopted a Semitic language when they moved into the region, right? And not a Semitic people that came from the south up, right? So the conclusion is that Jesus probably didn't look like an Arab or a Palestinian Jew, but actually probably looked something like that guy. There's your Jesus fuckers. Eat it.